We have time for questions, so make sure before you start speaking, you get the microphone. We've got 2 students here with microphones because there are people watching online that can't hear your questions if you don't have their microphone here. So if you have we'll start with Senator Kevin Lumberg. We'll get a microphone over to him.
Appreciate your words. You certainly covered a lot of territory in a very short space. In terms of policy, though, you've kind of boiled that down to the marriage penalty, and I'd like to challenge that a little bit and get your reaction to it. I think there are a couple of components of policy that aren't touched on in your talk, and maybe I've missed it, so you can tell me about that. But one is just in terms of public policy for the lowest class. From my opinion, we have created so many programs for people at that level that there's no there's no incentive to stay married, because it's not just a marriage penalty of if you legally tie the knot, now you have to say married on the thing.
Right.
But in fact, it's so easy to either not become married or to get divorced, because there are programs that just pick up for the mom in particular. There are a lot of things to pick up, and for the dad, there is a lot of advantages, as opposed to at the upper class levels. Right. You get divorced, and suddenly a third or maybe 2/3 of your income is now going for alimony issues, et cetera, et cetera. Sure. That's one policy issue. The other policy issue that I don't know you as a sociologist can actually measure yet, but in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years, the very definition of not just marriage, but gender has shifted so dramatically that I'd suggest that that's a policy failure that is going to explode. 20 years from now, sociologists, I think, are going to be looking back and saying, when we forgot what a marriage was, everything else crumbled.
Yeah, so 2 good questions. On the first question, I think it's definitely the case that a stronger welfare state has made marriage less economically essential than it used to be. And so that's certainly part of the story. I think kind of moving forward, the challenge will be too to sort of think about policies that kind of are designed to reinforce classic American ideals without undercutting the family. So you may know the work of Orrin Cass, for instance, who's at the Manhattan Institute, but he's been talking too about, for instance, some kind of wage subsidy that would sort of reinforce the kind of connection to work without penalizing marriage, and also without penalizing businesses too, as the minimum wage often can. So, that's, I think, one way to think about a creative kind of adjustment to the welfare state. But I take kind of the basic logic of your question, to be, on the money. In terms of the second question, I think we are kind of launching a pretty big experiment right now with, same-sex marriage, and I'm not sure how this transgender issue is going to play out with respect to sort of the definition of marriage per se, but it's certainly the case that it's a big experiment, and it could well fail. And I think you're right. We'll probably know in 10 or 20 years whether this new experiment is going to make it much more difficult for people to have a sense of who they are and what their families should look like, But right now, speaking as social scientists, it's sort of, it's an open question about how this is going to play out.
Question over here.
I noticed on one of your slides that children who are adopted are just below kids who are fostered.
Sure.
They're getting the most calls from the
school
about their behavior from
Yes.
school.
Right.
Yeah. Could you expound on that and
Sure.
maybe explain a little bit?
So my colleagues and I at the Institute for Family Studies have kind of looked in more detail at kind of the adoption story. For a long time when I was reading studies about this question, they would sort of say things like, well, kids in intact, married biological adoptive families do this way, and kids in other families do that way. But as we kind of begin to sort of break out those categories and sort of measure outcomes differently for kids who are from adoptive homes, we saw that on many sort of social, emotional, and educational outcomes, kids who were adopted were more likely to struggle. And I think, and this is actually, even though they're more likely to be raised by married, well-educated, more affluent parents, as well. So it's kind of what we call the adoption paradox. And how do you explain the adoption paradox? Well, I think you explain it a couple of ways. One is they're more likely to have experienced trauma in early life. Two is they're more likely not to have, established a kind of proper attachment, with their biological parents or their adoptive parents early on in life. And the third factor might be that I think too that for adoptive kids in adolescence and young adulthood, there can be some real questions around their own identity, and their roots, their origins, and kind of an inability to kind of know their biological parents, to know their kin, in some cases even to kind of know kind of what their ethnicity is in terms of where are my my ancestors from. They don't necessarily know that. So although of course now with the new test you can kind of figure that one out. But anyway, so I think there's some questions about identity that can kind of loom pretty large for adoptive children as well. So these are some of the reasons I think why they're more likely to struggle. And it also kind of reminds me too of Sarah McClanahan and Gary Sandifer's comment about if they were kind of designing an ideal family, they'd be designing one where both parents were the biological parents of the children. And I think we don't necessarily appreciate that reality, in our culture today, but there's something about this sort of biological kinship that the anthropologists would tell you kind of matters. And I think adoption is probably one example of the way in which kids who don't have that connection with their parents are just more likely to struggle.
Over here, Dr. Newell.
I really appreciate your study and your results and your conclusions. I think it's heartening to hear this, to see it, to share it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would build on Senator Lundberg's comments. When you look at the incentives and disincentives that can be brought to bear that can make a difference, as I look at this list right here, I'm reminded of the importance of vocational training.
Right.
Not everybody needs to get 2 or 3 degrees,
Right.
and they can provide very well for their family and be a breadwinner. And I'm hoping increasingly that will happen as a policy, public policy. The second thing is this, and I know you can only glean so much either from the literature or from designing a study, but I'd be very interested in knowing the difference in prenuptial agreements in the lower classes that you're referring to here, lower economic classes. I would think that would be a very rare kind of a consideration. In an upper echelon of economy of the economic scale, I would think it would be far more likely. Now, whether it would make a difference or not, but it certainly creates a level of disincentive for divorce, whether it's the woman being the breadwinner or the man. And I just think it would be interesting to know how that plays out in these kind of considerations.
So on the first question, I think Ann and I'm more hopeful that there actually has been a lot of bipartisan interest on vocational education, on doing more programmatically and shifting some of our higher education funding towards, although you might not like that, away from sort of the the 4-year colleges and more towards programs that are providing vocational skills to young adults. I think it's also, we still have to kind of push that mentality into our schools serving high school students, middle school students, and it hasn't yet, I don't think, penetrated enough in many of our school districts that we can be doing a lot more when it comes to IT, when it comes to manufacturing, when it comes to healthcare, to prepare our kids for these great vocational tracks so they can earn decent incomes and really support a family by pursuing these vocational tracks. But I do think there's movement that's positive in that direction. On the prenup point, I think it is definitely true that they're more common among probably the most affluent Americans. They're still comparatively rare. And my sense on the prenup story is that anything that's sort of kind of it's designed to kind of anticipate the possibility of divorce actually increases your risk of divorce, right? So if you're kind of planning for, well, if this thing doesn't quite work out, I've got this prenup that's going to cover that scenario. I think if you have that approach, that mentality, you're more likely to kind of end up divorced because you haven't fully given yourself over to your spouse. You haven't fully given yourself over to the marriage. You haven't fully created, that unity in your relationship, including financial unity, that's more likely to, promote marriage. The other piece of evidence they have on this particular score is, and this is actually more relevant for many people here probably today, including young adults today, because it's more and more common among young adults today, is that a lot of newly married couples now are keeping their checking accounts separate. My money, your money, mi casa, tu casa. But it turns out if that's your approach to money, you're more likely to end up in divorce court. So again, like when you have this commitment to really kind of living that spirit of unity in the marriage to its fullest, including financially, you're more likely to remain stably married. So on the prenup thing, I would guess that folks who are getting prenups are probably more likely compared to similar couples to end up divorced.
Another question? Yes, sir. Right here.
So just sort of following up on the question over here about adoption, just wondering what the differences in outcomes that you see between adopted kids and kids from single mothers, and kind of thinking of it in terms of the context of just having seen Unplanned this past weekend, and thinking about public policy ramifications of encouraging or discouraging abortion, but then what do you do with the kids and the mothers that have foregone the abortion?
Right. So I think in terms of kind of comparing single parents and adoptive parents, I would like to see on the adoptive front. I'd like to sort of see. We don't necessarily know enough about kind of their parents, so it would be just speaking as a scholar, it'd be nice to sort of have a sort of more information about kind of the parents to kind of do a better job of sort of what's the other scenario here for these children. So even though on some outcomes kids from single parent families do better than kids from adoptive households, it could be that the sort of in toto, the single mothers in that single parent group are in better shape than many of the parents put their kids up for adoption. So it's not a kind of a perfect comparison there from a methodological perspective. Now, in terms of just the issue of abortion, I would just say that I think even if kids aren't going to Harvard, or if kids are honestly sort of struggling in school more, or if they're more likely to have some other kinds of difficulties and challenges, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be born. So no, but that's sort of the practical takeaway here. I think is that we should be thinking about particularly ways as friends and neighbors, as churches, as communities, to sort of walk alongside of adoptive parents, to recognize that adoption is a beautiful thing, it's a great thing, but it's also, in many cases, a very difficult thing. And so, I think it means, practically, like making more of an effort to, if you have your kids invite the adopted kid over for, a play date or for a sleepover. Maybe it means, volunteering to babysit for adoptive parents. Be more intentional about those kinds of things to give both the kids and the parents some extra support. This is true, I think, also for single parents. Kind of make the same argument, for single parents too. I mean, to recognize it's a challenge to be a single parent. It's a challenge to be an adoptive parent in ways that I think often go way beyond the reality of parenting, biological kids in an intact family.
Yes, sir. We'll go up here.
One more question about single parent families. Is there any difference if the parent is single as a result of death or divorce?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the research suggests that on many outcomes, and this is kind of shocking, right? On many outcomes, divorce is worse than death for children. So I'm just sort of saying empirically, if you had to choose for your child, the death of a parent versus the divorce of their two parents, you would choose the death of the parent. So, not true for all outcomes, but it is striking that on some of the outcomes it looks like divorce is more challenging for kids than the loss of a parent. Yeah.
Other questions right there in the blue?
If I understood what you were saying, that divorce is more on the decline for more affluent, is that correct?
Yep.
That are better educated. Is there a relationship to the age that they're now marrying? Because what I'm seeing is that they're marrying later, so they're getting through college, they're kind of sowing their oats, they oftentimes cohabitat in advance, and so consequently, by the time they make that decision to marry, there's more likelihood that they're going to stay married. I don't know that that's true, but I'm just wondering,
Sure.
is there a correlation that they're waiting
Right.
longer?
Yeah, so it looks like right now when it comes to sort of marital stability, the sweet spot is sort of late 20s, basically. Although it's also kind of hard to know, it's also kind of the modal, we call the modal pattern. That's like when most people get married is in their late 20s and early 30s now. So it's sort of hard to disentangle when it's just kind of like they're kind of in the middle of the pack, and that's why they're less likely to get divorced. But it could be partly a maturity story as well. But it's also the case too when you look at marital quality that the sweet spot is sort of your mid-20s. Okay, so these are two different outcomes: marital happiness and marital stability. And what's interesting is that the people who get married in their mid-20s are more likely to have the happiest marriages, and those who get married in their late 20s have the most stable marriages. And I think on the stability piece, it's primarily about maturity. And on the marital quality piece, it's primarily about kind of being able to establish a sense of we-ness. Like we are a couple, that we have these traditions, we do these things together. We're sort of establishing our life together as a family and going forward. And so I think that's maybe why getting married at a younger age, comparatively speaking, gives them a comparative advantage in the marital quality department. So again, there's these two different outcomes that we're seeing play out for different ages at marriage. I also would say, too, that when it comes to marital stability, that couples who are attending church together don't face the same kinds of risks for divorce in general, but also when it comes to getting married in their mid or early 20s as well. So that sort of age factor is less salient for divorce for couples who attend church together and have a community sort of supporting them as younger married couples.
We'll do maybe one more question, Janine. We'll go to a student afterwards.
I have two questions. One is there's not only so much research about the well-being of children in a married situation, is also a lot of research about the well-being of adults. And we didn't talk about that tonight, but here's my question. With all this robust, plentiful data, what is going on that we cannot figure out a way in public policy to actually support this institution?
Well, it's a great question. So, when it comes to things like smoking, when it comes to things like obesity, when it comes to other kinds of issues that have sort of a clear biological and social impact on the population at large, no hesitation to address those kind of in public policy contexts and in the public square more generally. I think obviously with this issue of marriage and family structure, there are concerns about stigmatizing, marginalizing people, who've gotten divorced, who've had kids outside of wedlock, and also there's this commitment now that we have to tolerance, to acceptance, to diversity, and this sort of cultural commitment to these, to these ideals makes us unwilling to make judgments about people's family lives. So I think it's those two dynamics especially that help to explain why we're very hesitant to address these issues in a public context. But I think obviously we have to do that, and we have to recognize that until we do that, and until we actually also though I'm not talking here about finger wagging and moralizing, but basically sort of say folks, look, if you want to thrive when you're 45 or when you're approaching retirement financially, there's a success sequence. And if you get at least an education, like a high school education, you work full time, then you marry, and then you have kids, and you remain stably married, your odds of being poor are very low, about 3%. your odds of being in the middle class of a class are quite high. And your kids, obviously, odds of flourishing are also. So this is really about trying to sort of translate this message into a more hopeful and positive one about sort of saying, look, one piece of the American dream is related to sort of how you go about forming your own family and sustaining your marriage. And this is, we're not trying to be mean here. We're just trying to kind of like give you some wisdom that a lot of the folks living in, you know, for instance, even in Boulder, you know, would privately have taken to heart, even if publicly they're not willing to talk about it, you know, in their public schools and, you know, in Denver and elsewhere.
All right, Chad, last one.
Thank you so much for your time tonight. Just talking with all the students, we really appreciate your presentation. I just have two brief questions. Would you just be able to expand a little more on the Salt Lake City phenomenon with rags to riches? And the second one is, it seems as if the millennial generation and Gen Z, we've borne the brunt of the cohabitable household since about 1993. Do you believe there's a chance that our generation will try and reverse the effects since they had gone through it for their children?
So on the Salt Lake City here, the story is basically that so where a lot of families are headed by single-parent families, on this scatter plot over here in this slide. This is from Raj Chetty, who's an economist at Harvard University. Their odds of kind of getting up into the top 20% of the American economy as adults are much lower, you know, 5, 10%, you know, by this graph. Whereas kids who are in places where there are relatively few single-parent families in their communities, and many more two-parent families have odds that are more like 15, 20, 25, 30%. And so what this is sort of telling us is that a metropolitan area like Salt Lake City, where there are lots of two-parent families, is more likely to give kids who are growing up in poor families the opportunity as, you know, adults to be affluent, to be rich, to be in that top 20%. By contrast, metropolitan areas like Atlanta and Charlotte that have lots of single-parent families are much more likely to lock in poverty for poor kids. So these are metropolitan areas that are like right over here. And so if you grow up poor in a community with lots of single-parent families, you're more likely to stay poor as an adult. And so the question, of course, is, well, why is that? What's the story here? And I think the story here in part is about social supports and social controls. And so when there are lots of two-parent families in your neighborhood, what that means is there's more safety, okay? So you're less likely to fall into some kind of criminal activity or delinquency or gang activity when there are lots of two-parent families. Lots of fathers, to be clear here, who are helping to kind of, you know, shape the character in terms of public safety of the neighborhood. By contrast, lots of single mothers, there's more delinquency, there's more gang activity, there's more crime. And kids, particularly boys, are more likely to get on the wrong track, end up in trouble with the law and incarcerated. That's going to have a big impact on their mobility as adults, obviously, for the boys. And then when it comes to education, another kind of important part of the American dream, when you have lots of two-parent families, you've got lots of parents involved with the schools, you know, the PTO, you know, the bake sales, you know, all this volunteering we do now in our schools, et cetera. You know, so that's more likely to happen when you've got lots of two-parent families, you know, in the school system. Lots of single-parent families, the parents are less engaged, less involved in the schools, and that has impact on the quality of education. And then obviously also work is pretty important in realizing the American dream. And what we're seeing, particularly for men, for boys, is that when you're growing up in a neighborhood without lots of gainfully employed men, you don't have in your head kind of the model that, you know, work is integral to being a good man, you know. And so if there aren't like a lot of, you know, mentors or leads for jobs in your neighborhood, you know, as a young man, you're more likely not to sort of be stably employed. And so there's a neighborhood effect there. By contrast, if you grow up in a neighborhood where, you know, basically all the guys, you know, your neighbors, your friends, your own dad, you know, go to work in the morning, come home, you know, from work in the evening, that's going to be kind of like your template, your model. and that's going to shape how you approach the labor force as well. So it's just some ideas about how these neighborhood effects are playing out when it comes to things like crime, incarceration, education, work. And there's more work on this question, again, from Raj Chetty, who's got a big project with a lot of colleagues thinking about these issues at Harvard. Now, on the cohabitation front, it's hard for me to know where that's going to go. But on sort of the family front, and this is maybe a good way to end this discussion, I don't want us to be too pessimistic about where we're headed on the family front. We are seeing, actually, since the Great Recession, a decline in non-marital childbearing for the first time in decades. Also been seeing a decline in divorce. And it's just simple mathematics, right? If there are fewer kids being born outside of marriage, and if marriage is more stable, that means, if these trends continue, and of course, I don't want to kind of do the prophecy thing with sociology, but if these trends continue, we're going to see, I think, a slight increase in family stability for kids in America going forward, at least for the next couple of years. And I think it's part and parcel of what I call a culture of caution among millennials and among younger adults. And there's some bad parts of this culture of caution. We can talk about that later. But on the positive side of the ledger, I think young adults your age and a little bit older are today moving more carefully into marriage and more carefully into parenthood. And at least on the family stability front, that's I think, good news.